All right, we're looking at section 2 of chapter 13. We're still talking about a growing sense of nationhood within the country. We're going to dig into the politics of the time period, and it's become known as the era of good feelings. Some background on this. Monroe was elected president in 1816. This is his first term in office. Um, he really wins a decisive victory. His opponent runs on the Federalist ticket. 34 electoral votes for his opponent. Monroe wins 183. So America really made a statement that they wanted Monroe in office. He travels on a goodwill tour. Large crowds come out to greet him wherever he goes. Northern newspapers proclaim this time period as the era of good feelings. For many in the United States, this appeared to be a real dawning of a long-standing national unity. Like this is something that we can keep going and continue on for a long period of time. Uh, Monroe runs again for a second term in 1820, and this is even more of a blowout as far as presidential elections go. He wins all but one of the electoral votes. Independent Republican was John Quincy Adams, and we'll talk more about him later in the section. He's able to garner or earn one electoral vote in this election of 1820. So it was a real statement for what Monroe was doing politically. People had a belief in the things that were occurring and had a real positive attitude about the economy and the nation during this time period. So economic nationalism then. The spirit of nationalism is shown in the proposals that were brought forth in Congress to grow the national economy. Uh, Somebody who was a real forward thinker at this time was Henry Clay. He was a senator from Kentucky. He was a persuasive speaker. He was full of charm and intelligence. Not somebody you'd want to get into a debate with. He believed that America's future lay in capitalism. And capitalism is an economic system where goods are produced and distributed for profit. He really felt that the national government had to encourage this economic growth, and the way that the government would encourage that would be through different programs, opportunities for businesses to get involved and then grow, make a profit, and then that, of course, then spills over to the workers, and then they're earning more money and they're spending that money on goods and products, and it just keeps that cycle going. He had a plan. It was known as the American System. Um, so what the map is really showing us here, it was a three-part plan. So he felt that there should be taxes on imported goods, that this would protect the American industry and economies. Uh, so we kind of see what represents a border or fence protecting American industries. He felt that the federal government needed to spend money on transportation, roads, canals, bridges, to help expedite that shipping process and get things to where they needed to be faster than they've been able to do in the past. And then he also supported a new national bank, and he felt that this would standardize currency and provide credit to businesses who were looking for opportunities to grow and expand. A couple things about this second national bank then. The first national bank, the charter for the bank lapsed in 1811. So Clay brought forth this idea we should recharter the national bank, create a second national bank. A couple goofy things about it though. The bank was a private business, and the United States deposited funds there, and 2/3 of the bank stock were held by British interests, and we'll see that this creates some conflict later on. But it's important to note that, you know, Britain held stock in the national bank and up to 2/3 of it. So 66% of the stock within the bank was held by British businesses. So Clay had two main supporters for his economic system. And these two gentlemen, for them to come together on this idea and decide that they're going to support Clay really shows that they want to work together, bridge the political divide, and really get this done and help the American economy. One of those men is John C. Calhoun. He's a congressman from South Carolina. He was an ardent supporter of the War of 1812. He was part of that Warhawk group. He was a strong proponent of a national bank, a permanent road system, and import taxes to protect American industries. In other ways, though, on the flip side of this, he resisted federal power. He was the leading spokesman to protect states' rights, especially on the issue of slavery. So this is something then that's going to continue to come up as we move forward in American history. The other supporter for Clay's American system was Daniel Webster. Webster served in both houses of Congress representing the state of Massachusetts. He was from that Northeast region, and remember we talked about them. They were strong opponents of going to war with Britain and then fighting in the War of 1812. But he did support Clay's American system, and he is someone who would come to strongly challenge Calhoun's views that states had a right to defy the federal government. He was somebody, remember, Northeast United States was that federalist country, strong federal government. So he and Calhoun are going to be two people that really go at it here as time goes on. They're going to kind of branch apart and not see eye to eye on the issue of states' rights. Another area of nationalism that's really growing and developing is judicial nationalism. So we see that the Supreme Court is going to have a big impact on America and the economy and the growth of industry within the country. John Marshall, he was appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1801 by John Adams. He served on the court until 1835, and he wrote some of the most important decisions in U.S. history as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The effects of his decisions are long-standing. They still impact the United States today. They strengthened the role of the Supreme Court and the federal government's power over the states. And it also encouraged the growth of capitalism. Remember, capitalism is that economic system where goods are produced and distributed for profit. So you could say that Marshall was pro-business and pro-federal government. Some of his most important cases, the first one was McCulloch versus Maryland. And we see the cartoon here. The judge establishing a national bank who is John Marshall, was necessary to carry out the powers, Congress's power to tax. And then we have Maryland. Exactly. That's why we wanted to stop it. So Maryland was looking at this from a states' right perspective. The court confirmed, though, that Congress has the authority to create a national bank free from state interference. So McCulloch was the president of the bank, and Maryland tried to put a tax on the national bank because, remember, it was a private business. But the court ruled that the bank was necessary. It falls under that necessary and proper clause. And Maryland's tax on the bank itself interfered with the workings of the federal government, so it was deemed illegal, and they weren't allowed to do that. The second case was Fletcher versus Peck, and it had to do with the Yazoo land sales. Basically, the state of Georgia had gifted some land to someone through a land grant program. So they entered into this contract, and then they kind of realized, so that person then sold the land, and Georgia tried to go back on the contract. And then the court ruled that business contracts could not be broken, even for state legislatures. So they had to follow through, even if they felt that the law, the states cannot pass a law impairing the terms of a contract. So even though they felt that it was a bad law to start with, they couldn't go back on it. They couldn't rip up the contract. And then we have Gibbons versus Ogden, and this had to do with steamships operating in between New York and New Jersey. And Gibbons had a federal steamboat license. Ogden had a state license, and so there was some conflict there. And it reduced the state's powers by ending a steamboat monopoly in New York and New Jersey. So basically, the court's going to determine that only Congress has the power to regulate interstate trade. A state itself can regulate intrastate trade within the state, but what this does then is prevent statewide monopolies on particular services. And these three cases really have long-standing effects on U.S. history going forward. Gibbons and Ogden also promoted business growth by limiting the ability of the states to regulate transportation. So the end of the era of good feelings, the 1824 election really turned into a sticky situation. 5 candidates ran for office, including Henry Clay. So we have Henry Clay, William Crawford, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson, and then also John C. Calhoun ran for president this year as well. None of the candidates, though, received a majority in the Electoral College. So when we look at the election map here, the top one we see the electoral votes, and then the bottom one we see the popular vote, and this is what's going to upset some people. Andrew Jackson wins the popular vote, but then we see up here, nobody won a majority of the Electoral College votes. So there's no majority. The House of Representatives then decides the election, and they select John Quincy Adams, who's the son of John Adams, to be the next president of the United States. So basically what happens is, excuse me, they take the top 3 vote getters within the Electoral College system, and they let the House of Representatives vote on who should become the next president. This really upsets Andrew Jackson, and we remember Andrew Jackson, he's a general during the War of 1812. He led the American victory at the Battle of New Orleans, so he's a war hero. He's enraged by the results. He feels that he should be the president. He won the popular vote, and he vows to run again. And he uses the term the corrupt bargain. So the election of 1824 becomes synonymous with this corrupt bargain. He felt that Clay threw his support towards Adams, and then Adams agreed to make Henry Clay Secretary of State during his time as president. So Andrew Jackson vows to run again, which he does in 1828. He defeats John Quincy Adams, and his supporters become known as Democrats. So what we have here is the end of an era. The era of good feelings is over. We're back to that partisan strife, the political parties not getting along, and there's some events going on that really push the cooperation out the window, so to speak. We have the Panic of 1819, that growing sectionalism, where the Northeast is growing apart from the southern states. We see some boom-bust cycles in the economy. And a big part of this, we've talked about this before, that linear point of view when we're studying history, but things going on in Europe continue to have a ripple effect with what's going on in the United States. Europe's demand for food supplies really goes down with the recovery of the European continent after the Napoleonic Wars. So even during this year, 18 years after Napoleon's defeated in Europe, he's still having impact on the United States. So Europe's recovering from the Napoleonic Wars, are starting to be able to supply food for themselves, and they don't need all those imports from the United States. So we've looked at nationalism as far as the economy, judicial nationalism, and then over the next few sections here, we'll look at what America is doing culturally as well. We'll look at the art of the time period, the literature, and the music of the time period as well. So we'll see you next time.